There are moments in life that you do not plan for and cannot predict, moments that arrive without warning in the middle of an ordinary day, and that once they have passed, permanently alter the way you see certain things, certain situations, certain kinds of people, certain assumptions about who holds power in a given room and who does not. I have lived through a handful of such moments in my 43 years. The one I am about to tell you about happened in row 7 of a commercial aircraft on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and it involved my grandmother, who was 79 years old at the time and who was, by any reasonable measure, the least likely person in that cabin to silence a plane full of strangers with a single quiet sentence. But she did, and I was sitting close enough to hear every word of it. Let me start with who my grandmother is, because you need to understand her before you can fully appreciate what she did, and the two things, who she is and what she did, are inseparable. Her name is Elena Marsh. She was born in 1944 in a small city in the Midwest, the second of 5 children in a working-class family that had very little money and a very clear set of values about what mattered and what did not. She grew up during a time when the culture around her told women, continuously and from every direction, that their role was to be agreeable, accommodating, undemanding, and grateful for whatever they were given. Elena absorbed this message the way her generation absorbed most cultural messages. She heard it, she understood it, and she spent the next 6 decades quietly ignoring it whenever it conflicted with something she knew to be true. She was not a loud person. She was not a confrontational person in the sense that people usually mean by that word. She did not seek conflict, and she did not enjoy it. But she had, somewhere underneath the soft-spoken exterior and the impeccable courtesy and the habit of offering tea to everyone who came into her house, a spine made of something considerably more durable than the social graces she displayed on top of it. She had been a school teacher for 31 years. Elementary school, 3rd grade, the same school in the same city for 3 decades until she retired at 62. If you have ever known a 3rd grade teacher who spent 31 years with 8 and 9-year-olds, you know a specific kind of person, a person who has developed, through necessity and experience, an absolute precision in communication. Not precision in the sense of coldness or harshness. Precision in the sense of saying exactly what needs to be said, in exactly the right number of words, at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right tone to produce exactly the desired effect. Elena had this quality in abundance, and what made it remarkable was that after 31 years it had become entirely natural in her. She was not calculating when she used it. It was simply how she spoke when she felt the situation required it. She had been married to my grandfather, Harold, for 56 years. Harold was 81 at the time of this story, a retired civil engineer who had the particular quality of presence that certain tall, quiet men develop over a long life. He was not imposing in any aggressive sense, but he had a solidity about him, a rootedness, that made people feel that things in his vicinity were probably going to be all right. He had had a mild heart episode the previous year, nothing catastrophic, but significant enough to require ongoing monitoring and a permanent prescription for a blood thinner that meant he needed the aisle seat on flights, because he needed to be able to get up and move without disturbing anyone, as sitting for long periods with his circulation required attention. They were flying that Tuesday in October to visit my aunt in Portland, their youngest daughter, whom they visited twice a year and who could not easily make the trip to them because of her own health situation. The flight was not a luxury, it was a necessity. The aisle seat was not a preference, it was a medical requirement. They had booked the seats months in advance, specifically selecting row 7, seats C and D, aisle and middle on the left side of the plane, because the aisle access was what Harold needed, and the middle seat next to him was where Elena always sat, so she could monitor him without making him feel monitored, which is the particular art of a long marriage. I was on the same flight by coincidence. I live in the same city as my grandparents, and I had a work trip that happened to be on the same day to a destination 1 connection away from Portland, so I had looked up their flight and booked a seat on it specifically so I could travel with them as far as the connection. I was in row 11, 4 rows behind them, which meant I had a clear sight line to what happened and could hear most of it, and what I could not hear directly, I had confirmed for me afterward by Elena herself, who described it with the particular clarity of a woman who had processed the experience fully and retained every detail. The boarding process was normal for the first portion. Elena and Harold boarded in the priority boarding group, as they always did when traveling, because the airline's boarding process allowed elderly travelers to board early and because Harold's mobility, while not severely impaired, benefited from the extra time to get settled without the pressure of people moving down the aisle behind him. They found their seats, row 7, C and D, stowed their carry-on bags with the assistance of a flight attendant who was friendly and efficient, and settled in. Elena had her book out. Harold had his crossword. They were comfortable. They had done this many times. I boarded in the general boarding group about 15 minutes later and made my way to row 11. I could see them 2 rows ahead, the top of Elena's white hair above the seat back, the distinctive grey cardigan Harold always wore when he traveled because he found plane cabins cold. The flight was full. People continued boarding and filing past and finding their seats. Approximately 10 minutes before the scheduled departure time, a couple came down the aisle and stopped at row 7. They were, I estimated, in their mid-30s, a man and a woman, both well-dressed, both with the particular energy of people accustomed to being in a hurry and being accommodated. The man was holding boarding passes and looking at the seat numbers with the expression of someone who has found what he is looking for. He said, loudly enough for me to hear from row 11, that they were in the wrong seats and that row 7, seats C and D, were his seats. Harold said pleasantly that he did not think so and showed his boarding pass. The man looked at his boarding pass. He looked at Harold's boarding pass. He said there must have been a mix-up and that he and his wife had been assigned these seats and that he needed the aisle because of his back. Elena looked up from her book at this point. She did not say anything yet. She looked at the man with the particular quality of attention that a woman who spent 31 years teaching 3rd grade gives to a situation she is assessing before she responds to it. Harold said he understood about the back, and he was sorry to hear it, and that he himself had a medical condition requiring aisle access, which was why he had booked this specific seat months in advance, and that he was not in a position to give it up. The man said he was sure they could work something out, and that there were other aisle seats on the plane, and that Harold and his wife could find something suitable further back. Harold said he preferred to stay in the seat he had booked. The man's wife said, not quietly, that it was really not a big deal and that the elderly couple should be able to find another seat just as easily, and that they were going to be late, and this needed to be resolved. The phrase elderly couple, I noted it from row 11. So did everyone in the rows between us, because the woman had said it at a volume that was not quite a shout, but was considerably above the conversational register appropriate to the situation, and the word elderly applied to 2 people sitting in their own booked seats who had done nothing except decline to give those seats to strangers, landed in the cabin with a particular quality. Several heads turned. Elena closed her book. She set it carefully on her lap. She straightened slightly in her seat. She looked at the man standing in the aisle and then at his wife standing behind him, and she was quiet for a moment in the specific way that 31 years of teaching 3rd grade produces, the moment of silence before the response that is designed to give the room time to understand that a response is coming and that it will be worth listening to. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely calm and entirely clear, and pitched at exactly the volume that reached every person in the rows around them without being raised, the following words. She said that she and her husband had booked these seats 4 months ago. She said her husband had a medical condition that required aisle access and that this was documented with the airline and was the reason they had selected this row and these specific seats. She said she understood that traveling was stressful and that she hoped the rest of their journey would be comfortable. And then she said, without any change in her tone, without any sharpness or heat in her voice, the sentence that silenced the plane. She said that if the gentleman needed the aisle for his back, the appropriate way to have addressed that was by booking an aisle seat when he purchased his ticket, which was what she and her husband had done, and that she was happy to wait while he spoke to the flight attendant about available options, but that she and Harold were going to remain where they were. And then she opened her book. The cabin was silent for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Not a performance silence, not the held-breath silence of people waiting for an escalation. A different kind of silence. The silence of approximately 140 people who have just heard something said with such complete, quiet correctness that there is simply nothing to add. The man stood in the aisle. His wife stood behind him. Neither of them said anything for what I estimate was about 8 seconds, which is a very long time to stand in a plane aisle in silence. Then the flight attendant, who had been watching from the front galley, came down the aisle with the particular purposeful walk of a person who has assessed a situation and knows what to do with it. She asked the man and his wife if she could help them find their seats. The man showed her his boarding pass. She looked at it and said she would be right back. She went to the front, consulted something, came back, and said there were 2 seats available in row 14, one of which was an aisle seat, and she would be happy to escort them there. The man looked at Elena. Elena was reading her book. The man and his wife followed the flight attendant to row 14. The cabin, which had been silent, made a sound that I can only describe as a collective exhale. And then, from somewhere in the rows behind me, a single person began to clap. Slowly at first, 1 pair of hands, and then a second pair joined it, and then a third. And within about 10 seconds, a significant portion of the cabin was applauding, quietly but unmistakably, for a 79-year-old woman in row 7 who had not raised her voice or changed her expression, and who was now reading her book as though nothing had happened. Elena did not look up from the book. Harold looked up from his crossword, registered what was happening, and made a small sound that I recognized even from row 11 as the particular sound he made when he was trying not to smile and not entirely succeeding. I sat in row 11, and I felt something that I have felt very few times in my life, and that I want to try to describe accurately because it is not a common emotion, and it does not have a precise name. It was a combination of pride and recognition, and something very close to relief. The relief of watching someone handle a moment with such complete, unhurried correctness that the moment itself seemed to reorganize around them. The man who had stood in the aisle demanding that my grandparents give up their seats had walked away with his boarding pass and his assumptions about how this was going to go, and what had stopped him was not aggression or volume or anything that cost Elena anything. What had stopped him was 1 quiet sentence delivered with 31 years of precision and 56 years of knowing exactly what was worth standing firm about and what was not. I looked at the back of Elena's white head above the seat back in row 7. She turned a page. We took off on schedule. I spent most of that flight thinking about what I had just witnessed and about why it had affected me the way it did. By the time we reached cruising altitude, I had arrived at something like an answer, or at least the beginning of one. What Elena had done was not complicated. She had stated facts, offered understanding, and declined to move. That was the entirety of it. No drama, no escalation, no performance. But the reason it worked, the reason it produced that specific silence and that specific applause was not just the content of what she said. It was the absolute absence of apology in how she said it. She had not apologized for being in the seat she had booked. She had not softened her refusal with excessive empathy for the man's alleged back problem. She had not made her position sound like a request or a negotiation or a tentative suggestion that she was prepared to walk back if pressed. She had stated her position with the flat certainty of someone who knows she is right and does not need the room to confirm it. That certainty, I thought, was the thing. It was the thing the man in the aisle had not expected and had not known how to respond to, because what he had expected was the thing that people in his position usually get, the slow erosion of the other party's position under the pressure of social discomfort and the desire to avoid conflict. He had expected Harold to say, well, perhaps we could, and Elena to say, oh, I suppose, if you really need, and the two of them to find themselves standing in the aisle with their carry-ons, wondering how they ended up giving their seats to a younger couple who had not booked correctly. He did not get that. He got Elena, and Elena, it turned out, was not the thing he had expected at all. We landed at the connection city on schedule. I walked with my grandparents to the connecting gates area, and we had coffee for 45 minutes before Harold and Alina's Portland flight boarded. We talked about the flight, among other things, and I asked Alina what she had been thinking during the exchange with the man. She thought about this for a moment, stirring her coffee. Then she said she had been thinking that Harold needed that seat, and that was all she had been thinking. She said the rest of it, the words, the tone, the specific thing she said, that was not something she had planned. It was just what was true. I said I thought it was one of the most effective things I had ever seen anyone say in a difficult moment. She looked at me with the mild amusement of a woman who spent 31 years being told by small children that she was the best teacher and who had learned to accept compliments graciously without attaching too much to them. She said she hoped the man had found the aisle seat comfortable. I said I thought probably he had. She finished her coffee. Harold finished his crossword. Their flight was called and they stood up, and I hugged them both, and I watched them walk toward the gate, Harold tall and steady with his carry-on, Alina beside him with her book already back in her hand, and I thought about the particular kind of quiet power that a person develops over a long life when they have spent that life being precise about what matters and certain about who they are. Not the power that announces itself, not the power that demands recognition or volume or room, the power that simply states what is true and then opens a book and waits for the world to catch up. The story of the plane on its own would be a complete story. Alina stated her position, the man moved to another seat, the plane took off. Beginning, middle, end. The kind of story you tell at a dinner table and people nod and smile and someone says good for her and someone else asks what the man said and you tell them and they laugh. A contained, satisfying little story about a moment when something went right. But the story did not end at the gate in Portland. It continued, and the continuation is the part I want to tell you now, because it is the part that turned a good dinner table story into something I have been thinking about for 3 years, and that has genuinely changed how I understand certain things. 3 days after the flight, I received a voicemail from a number I did not recognize. I almost did not listen to it. I get enough spam calls that unknown numbers rarely reward attention, but something made me play it. The voicemail was from a woman named Sandra Ellison, who said she had been on the same flight as me and my grandparents and had obtained my number through a mutual acquaintance she had identified through a social media post I had made about the flight. She said she was a documentary filmmaker and that what she had witnessed on the plane had struck her as something worth capturing, and that she was in the early stages of a project about dignity and public behavior and how people respond to unfairness in communal spaces, and she wanted to know if she could speak with me and, if possible, with the elderly woman she had seen in row 7. I called her back. We spoke for about 40 minutes. Sandra was genuine and specific in her interests. She was not looking for viral content or a simple conflict narrative. She was interested in what she called the mechanics of dignity, by which she meant the specific ways that certain people navigate moments of confrontation without losing composure or resorting to the tactics that the other party expects. She said she had seen the exchange in row 7 and had been, in her words, professionally stopped by it. She had sat in her seat thinking about it for the rest of the flight and had not been able to let it go. She said the thing that interested her was not that Alina had won the argument. It was how she had won it. The specific quality of certainty without aggression, the absence of apology, the precision of the language. I said I would speak to Alina and Harold about whether they were interested in talking to her. I called Alina the following day. I explained who Sandra was and what she wanted. Alina was quiet for a moment. Then she said she did not think she had done anything particularly interesting and that a documentary filmmaker probably had better subjects to pursue. I said I thought Sandra would disagree and that the choice was entirely hers. Alina said she would think about it. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she called me and said she had spoken with Harold and that they would be willing to meet with Sandra, but that she wanted to be clear about something first. She said she was not interested in being a symbol or a story. She said she had done what she had done on that plane because it was the correct thing to do in that situation, and she would have done it in any situation where the same facts applied, and she did not think it was remarkable enough to be made into a symbol. She said if Sandra wanted to talk about something real, about how people treat each other in shared spaces, about the assumptions people make about elderly people and what they will and will not accept, about what it means to be courteous to people and to expect courtesy in return, then she was willing to have that conversation. I relayed this to Sandra. Sandra said that was exactly the conversation she wanted to have. They met in Portland the following month, in the living room of my aunt's house, over tea. I was not present for the meeting, it was not my conversation to be in, but my aunt was there and she told me about it afterward, and Alina herself described it to me in a phone call the following week. Sandra had brought a small recording setup and had asked questions for about 2 hours. Alina had answered them in the way she answers everything, directly, without embellishment, without the self-consciousness that most people bring to being recorded. Harold had sat in his armchair and contributed occasionally in the way that a man who has been married for 56 years contributes to a conversation about his wife, briefly and precisely, and with the particular pride of someone who has known the subject for a very long time and has reached settled conclusions about her. The questions Sandra had asked were not primarily about the plane. They were about Alina's life, about teaching, about the specific skills that 31 years of managing a classroom of 8-year-olds had developed, about what it meant to be certain without being cruel, about how you maintain your position under social pressure without losing the courtesy that the situation still requires. Alina had answered these questions with the same flatness and precision she brought to everything, and Sandra had, apparently, recorded about 3 hours of material, of which she said perhaps 45 minutes would be usable for her project. What interested me about what my aunt and Alina described from that meeting was a specific exchange that had happened toward the end, when Sandra had asked Alina what she would say to people who found themselves in similar situations, who were pushed or pressured or asked to give something up that was legitimately theirs, and who did not know how to hold their ground without either capitulating or escalating. Alina had thought about this for a moment. Then she had said something that I am going to try to reproduce as accurately as I can from my aunt's description and Alina's own words to me afterward, because it is the thing from this entire story that I have returned to most often. She said the question people usually ask in those situations is, how do I win this? She said that was the wrong question. She said the right question was, what is actually true here? Because if you are clear about what is actually true, if you know your facts, if you know your position, if you know what you are entitled to and why, then stating the truth is not a battle. It is just a statement. And a statement that is fully true, stated without apology, does not require any follow-up. It simply sits there and is true, and the other person has to decide what to do with it. She said the apology was the thing people got wrong most often, not the real apology, the apology for something you have actually done wrong, which is important and which you should always give. The reflexive apology, the apologetic softening that people put in front of their positions when they are uncomfortable asserting them. The I'm sorry, but and the I don't mean to be difficult, and the I understand your situation, and I hope this isn't inconvenient. She said those phrases were courteous in their intent, but dishonest in their effect, because what they communicated was that you were uncertain about your position, that you were open to being persuaded that you were wrong, and that the other party had a reasonable chance of getting what they wanted if they pressed a little harder. She said she had learned in the classroom that the moment you apologized for a correct position, you had already weakened it, and that the children who were going to test you could feel that weakness in the air the way animals feel weather. I said that was remarkably applicable outside the classroom. She said 3rd grade prepared you for most things. Sandra's documentary project, as it turned out, was accepted into a regional film festival the following spring. It was a short-form piece, about 22 minutes, that wove together several stories about dignity in public spaces, of which Alina and Harold's story was one component. Alina watched it at my aunt's house when a copy was sent to them and called me afterward. She said it was a good film and that Sandra had done a fair job with the material and that she looked old on camera. I told her she looked wonderful on camera. She said I was biased. I said yes, I was, and that it was still true. I watched the film online after it was made available. The Alina and Harold segment was about 6 minutes. The interview footage was intercut with film of the street where they had lived for most of their marriage, the school where Alina had taught for 31 years, and footage of Harold at his drafting table in the study, still working occasionally on engineering problems he found interesting in retirement. Sandra had included, near the end of the segment, a brief reconstruction of the plane incident using footage of an aircraft cabin, not actors, just the space, with Alina's voice describing the exchange in the same plain language she used for everything. The moment that Sandra had chosen to end the segment on was a single line from the interview. Alina had been talking about courtesy, about the difference between courtesy as a form of social lubrication and courtesy as a genuine expression of regard for another person, and she had said something that Sandra had clearly recognized as the thing the segment was building toward, because she had let it breathe, let it sit on screen for a moment before cutting to the credits. Alina had said that she had been courteous to the man on the plane because courtesy was what the situation required and because she was a courteous person. She had not been courteous because she was uncertain or because she wanted to soften her position or because she was trying to manage his response. She had been courteous because it was who she was. And the reason she had been able to be simultaneously courteous and completely firm was that she understood, and had always understood, that those two things were not in conflict. Courtesy was how you treated people. Firmness was how you held your position. They operated on completely different axes and had nothing to do with each other. And the mistake that people made was to think that being firm required being rude or that being courteous required being soft. Neither was true. You could be completely and entirely both, and when you were, there was almost nothing that could move you. The film ended. I sat at my desk and looked at the screen for a while. I thought about row 7. I thought about the man who had stood in the aisle with his boarding pass and his confidence and his assumption about how elderly people respond when younger people ask them for things. I thought about the 8 seconds of silence after Alina opened her book. I thought about the applause and about Harold trying not to smile over his crossword. I thought about what I had understood in that moment and what I had understood more fully now, watching the documentary, having had 3 years to sit with the experience. What I had understood in the moment was that Alina had done something effective and that it was worth understanding why. What I understood now was larger than that. What I understood now was that Alina had not done something effective in the sense of a technique or a strategy. She had simply been, in that moment, completely herself, the self that 31 years of teaching and 56 years of marriage and 79 years of living had produced. She had not reached for a tool. She was the tool. The precision was not applied. It was inherent. And that was why it could not be defeated. Because you cannot defeat something by escalating against it when the thing itself does not escalate. You cannot undermine a position by applying social pressure when the person holding the position is not holding it with social comfort, but with something older and quieter and considerably more permanent than that. He had brought his confidence to a situation that required certainty, and they were not the same thing, and Alina knew the difference between them because she had been certain about who she was for a very long time. I called Alina the week after I watched the film. We talked for about an hour, mostly about other things, Harold's checkup results, which were good, and my cousin's new baby, and a book Alina was reading that she thought I would like. Near the end of the call, I told her I had watched the documentary again and that the last thing she said in it was the best thing I had heard anyone say in a long time. She asked which part. I told her the part about courtesy and firmness being on different axes. She said, oh, that. She said it was just something she had worked out a long time ago and that she was glad Sandra had found it useful. I said I thought it was more than useful. I said I thought it was one of those things that once you understand it, you cannot ununderstand it, and the world looks slightly different. Alina was quiet for a moment. Then she said she thought Harold would probably agree with that and that she would tell him I had called. She said goodbye with the same warmth she always did, and I said goodbye, and I hung up and sat for a while in the particular feeling that conversations with Alina leave you with, the feeling of having been in the presence of someone who is exactly what they appear to be, all the way through, with no gap between the surface and what is underneath. Harold and Alina flew to Portland again the following October. Same airline, different row. They booked row 6 this time at Harold's insistence because he said he wanted to be further forward and Alina had not argued with him, which was itself a form of courtesy. The flight was uneventful. Alina finished her book before they landed. Harold completed the crossword somewhere over the mountains. They arrived in Portland on schedule, were met at the gate by my aunt, and had dinner that evening at the restaurant they always went to when they visited, the Italian place on the corner that had been there for 30 years and where the owner knew their order before they sat down. Some things, when they are as they should be, simply continue being as they should be. Row 7 stays with me. I do not think it will ever fully leave me, not the drama of it, because on the scale of dramatic moments in the world, it was genuinely minor. A disagreement about airplane seats resolved in less than 5 minutes with no lasting consequences for anyone involved. But the quality of it. The specific texture of watching someone hold a position that was entirely theirs to hold, with a completeness and a quietness that made the holding look effortless even though I understood, having watched Alina my entire life, that what looked like effortlessness was actually the product of everything she had ever been and every choice she had ever made about who she intended to be. She opened her book. The plane took off. That is the whole story, and it is enough. Thumbnail text. Line 1, they told Grandma and Grandpa to give up their booked seats. Grandma's one quiet sentence froze the entire airplane. Line 2, then a filmmaker heard about it, and what happened next changed everything.